Alright, welcome back everyone to another episode of Officer Training School. My name is Joshua Howard today, and today we're going to be talking about Tempestus Aquilons. Also, my name is Joshua Howard most days, but it is also my name this day. I've been seeing a lot of discourse about Aquilons on the internet, from Art of War, Vanguard Tactics, on Reddit, Discord, whatever, and if you think Aquilons aren't one of the most busted units in the game, you need more imagination. Because Aquilons are absolutely game-changing with the way that they have been designed. I'm kind of wondering, honestly, if they are going to survive when the Codex comes out. But with all that said, let's go ahead and talk about what you can do with Aquilons and how you're supposed to be using them. So let's go ahead and launch right on into the basics. Aquilons are incredibly flexible problem solvers. If you have an issue on the board, Aquilons probably have a way to mitigate it. If you need to get into certain places, if you need certain units removed, if you need to do something in order to move block your opponent, Aquilons can do all of this and more. But the major things that you're going to be looking to do with Aquilons almost every game is none of your opponent's little scoring and tech pieces are safe against Aquilons. If you're trying to play with Cultists, Aquilons are going to kill them. If you're trying to play with MSU Space Marines, Aquilons is going to kill them. If you're trying to play with Stealth Suits, Aquilons are going to kill them. Pretty much everything smaller than about 5 Space Marines, Aquilons are going to kill, and you will be surprised when you start playing more competitively how many armies are running little units that Aquilons are perfect for preying upon. Other things you can do with Aquilons are really good charge blockers, and we'll talk about this more as we start getting closer to the end. And even in our matchups where our opponents are not running units like this, or maybe as the meta evolves and makes it harder to use Aquilons, at worst, Aquilons are just slightly overpriced scoring pieces. In general, you would still prefer to spend 50 points on a 5-man Scion unit for scoring than you would 90 points for Aquilons. However, that is the failure state. That is the worst possible outcome for Aquilons, is that is all they are. They are almost always going to be more useful than that. So in general, if you want to use your Aquilons well, it's mostly about understanding 40k at a higher level and having some imagination. You're going to be able to do things with Aquilons that there is nothing else, not only in our army, but nothing else in the game can do this to the same degree that we can. So let's go ahead and start by talking about how we want to equip our Aquilons. To start off with, we're going to be taking 8 las carbines, including the one on the sergeant. There's no reason to give him a power weapon and a pistol when we could get an extra shot. Remember, when we deep strike within 3 inches, we are not eligible to charge that turn, so the fact that we have, an extra pip of AP or whatever on the power weapon as opposed to the close combat weapon almost never matters. We're going to be replacing one of our las carbines with a long las. To be honest, it is slightly worse into killing things like cultists, but we are already overkilling most of these units anyway, even with the 8 las carbines, and the long las makes us a little bit better into things that have 2 or 3 wounds. Whether you want to take the plasma or the multi-carbine is a little bit of a dealer's choice. In general, into 2 wound or 1 wound models, a plasma is almost always better into pretty much every single one of these targets. However, if you're going into single model targets, like say you're hunting a Biovore, or say you're looking to pick off an Autarch Wayleaper, the Melta is going to be a little bit better into these targets. As for the Sentry we're going to be equipping the Sergeant with, the Flamer Sentry is going to be doing the most damage out of the options that we have. This is mostly because it does slightly more damage into anything that is toughness 3 or toughness 4, regardless of whether they're in cover or not. Against targets that are not in cover, the volley gun gets very close to how much damage the Flamer Sentry does. However, against targets in cover, the Flamer is definitely better. Additionally, while the volley gun does have lethal hits into certain targets, which can make it better into things like Terminators, it really struggles into stealth targets, which is a lot of the things that Aquilons are going to be trying to shoot at, simply because the volley gun has to hit its target. Now, I've been seeing a lot of people talk about Aquilons, like why would I want to bring a unit of Aquilons versus a unit of Scions? So let's go ahead and talk about the primary ways that we are going to be using Aquilons versus the way that we normally use Scions. The major advantage that Aquilons have is that Aquilons can get to places that Scions can't, and their primary use for Aquilons is to kill chaff and support pieces. So Aquilons are less going to be competing with Scions than they are going to be competing with our indirect fire. Something that a mortar or a bombast would shoot at is generally going to be the kind of thing that you're going to want to drop your Aquilons to kill. But Aquilons have a couple of benefits here. One, they're likely to full kill it in one activation, and 2, they have the ability to go after lone operative characters, whereas our indirect fire cannot do this. To contrast this to Scions, Scions are mostly used to kill light and medium targets on objectives. If you're trying to kill Chaff or Assault Marines with jump packs or Terminators or Custodians Wardens, Scions are going to be doing this way more effectively than Aquilons ever will. Additionally, Especially if you give the Scions melt-a-guns, they're going to be way better at popping transports on light tanks like rhinos and some predators, and there's some like Tyranid stuff that you can also go after with the Scions in ways that you cannot really do with Aquilons. But that's mostly when we're talking about big units of Scion. A command squad plus 5 or a command squad plus 10. On the other hand, Aquilons should rarely be used as throwaway scoring pieces. They're simply too expensive for that. And in a lot of matchups, we have something better that we can do with them than just using them as throwaway scoring pieces. However, if we take 5-man units of Scions, or MSU, they're really good throwaway scoring units because we don't care that they die. It's 50 points. We're going to trade that for 5 VP every single time. In contrast, Aquilons are generally going to be used to deny our opponent's ability to score. If we can take them off of a primary objective, that is just as good as scoring an additional primary objective for ourselves. So with this in mind, Aquilons tend to be a scalpel, whereas Scions tend to be a hammer. We can do almost anything we want with Aquilons, whereas Scions have two very clearly defined jobs. So let's go ahead and start off by talking about one of the most obvious primary jobs that we're going to be giving Aquilons, and that is going after Chaff. Aquilons are going to be killing an average of 12 Cadians in cover, and you can see this on the right, on the turn that they drop, if you shoot the Flamer when they drop and then shoot it again during your shooting phase. It's important to remember that these are Cadians in cover, so these are going to be more durable than Cadians in the open or Cultist or Grot equivalents, which oftentimes have 6-up saves, which means that they will not get a save going up against Aquilons. Against those targets, we're very easily killing 15 or more 1-wound models. This is really important because it is incredibly difficult to screen out something that can 3-inch deep strike. We'll talk a lot more about why this is so difficult later on in the video. The other major thing that we're going to be looking at trying to kill is small marine units. Targets like Scout Marines, Stealth Suits, or Death Marks, things that are a little bit more durable, oftentimes they're toughness 4 or 5, and they have a 4-up save, we're not going to be consistently killing them just by dropping. If we shoot the Flamer twice, we're going to be killing most of them on average. However, one of the things that we can do is when we drop, we don't have to shoot the sentry, because most TOs are going to rule that if you drop and shoot the sentry, you're no longer eligible to throw a grenade. So, in order to get around this, we have to note that the grenade is going to be doing an average of 3 wounds to a target, whereas the Flamer against a lot of these targets is going to be doing 1, maybe 2 if we're lucky. So, we just take 1 activation with the Flamer and chuck a grenade, and this will almost always put us over the top in being able to kill things like Scout Marines and Stealth Suits. Do note, though, that this means that we can only do it once. We aren't going to be able to kill multiple Scout Marines or multiple Stealth Suit units in one turn, unless we get a little bit lucky. One of the really important things to remember about this is that the threat is just as important as the execution. Just having Aquilons in reserve that your opponent knows that they're going to have to screen out means that your opponent needs to be very careful doing things like sabotage or recover assets with Chaff units, simply because they give us an entire turn to try and shoot them back. What this oftentimes means is that your opponent's going to have to do it with higher cost and more durable units. For armies like the Guard, this isn't necessarily an issue because we can do it with a Chimera, which the Aquilons are never killing. But more elite armies like Dark Angels Gladius now has to devote an entire Deathwing Knight unit in order to score 3 points, which is a huge difference for us. The other thing that Aquilons are pretty decent at is assassinating small units. Here's a collection of some common lone ops and other similar units that you might be going after just to remove some utility from your opponents. You'll notice that things like the Imperial Assassin, so a Calidus or a Vindicare, the Autarch, Wayleaper, and Ethereals die almost every single time that we go for them with very high consistency. However, other units that are a bit more durable, like a Lictor or a Biovore, or even Gaunt's Ghost, are very difficult for us to take down. For a lot of these kind of units, we want to be throwing a grenade instead in order to try and make sure that they die. What I would generally recommend is if you go to unitcrunch.com and just punch in the data for both the Aquilons and for whatever targets you're thinking about going after, and just kind of get a sense of how likely it is that a lot of these characters are going to be dying, because it'll help you a lot when trying to go after some of these more pesky individuals. Now, one of the really important things that we can do by going chaff hunting is the fact that we can do it in the same phase that we are trying to bring in other reinforcements. Because of the way that the sentry works on the drop, you get to do it when you drop, and you don't even have to wait for a second unit of Aquilons to drop. You can just drop one and see how much damage you do. So something you can try to look for is if you drop one unit of Aquilons and fire the Flamer Sentry into a certain target, you can see how many models your opponent has to remove and how much space that potentially opens up for other things you're trying to bring in from reserve. Keeping in mind that the Sentry Flamer will kill about 3 Cadians. But if the unit is already small, and they're already strung out in certain ways, that can potentially open up a lot of space in certain parts of the board for you to bring in your other reinforcements. The other really great thing about this is by doing this with one unit of Aquilons, we can potentially make room for another unit of Aquilons. So if your opponent is trying to screen out parts of the board with only units of Chaff, this is a great way to be way more aggressive with Aquilons than you might have otherwise expected. Okay, now let's talk about another major thing that some people have talked about quite a bit, and that is rapid ingressing them for an instant screen. If your opponent has a charge that is longer than about 4.5 inches between your unit and their unit, you can use rapid ingress to instantly create a screen. Remember, we still have to remain 3 inches away from our opponent, and our bases are a little bit larger than an inch wide, so it's really about like 4.2. But it can create a situation where things that are going to be charging into our more valuable assets like our Lehman Russes suddenly might not be able to do so. And this is what it could look like. This is at its most effective against armies that can't shoot the screen to allow the charge anyway. So if you're going up against a more balanced list that has access to both shooting and charging, you have to be careful that you're going to put them in positions where they're not going to get shot. This means that doing it up against things like Custodian Guard or Custodian Wardens is going to be way less effective than doing it against Khorne Berserkers, simply because the Wardens or the Custodian Guard are just going to clear the screen and then charge their original target anyway. However, something like World Eaters or Orcs, where they are only really shooting with pistols, they're not going to kill enough to really punch holes in your screen. But something really important to remember is even shooting armies can't shoot through walls. And there are going to be times where they're going to try and charge you through a wall, and you're going to be able to drop guys in a position where they cannot see them. So always be looking for these opportunities, especially up against armies that like to charge. Some other important things to note while we're talking about this. When you go for a lot of these charge blocks, the first thing that you're going to be looking for is the fact that you are almost definitely going to get consolidated into afterward. Anything that wants to be charging one of our tanks is almost definitely going to have the volume and the quality of attacks in order to kill a unit of Aquilons. So, if you are going to be dropping your screen, do note that you are going to lose those Aquilons, and then the tank is going to be in combat on your next turn. However, this is way better than the tank being dead. But we do have some options like Lehman Rust Demolishers and Hellhounds that don't really care about being in combat simply because they are going to be functioning at full effectiveness anyway. So you might want to think about bringing these a little bit more if you are going to be running Aquilons. The other major thing that you need to make sure that you do is when you set up your screen, your opponent cannot charge through or around your new Aquilons in order to get into the original target anyway. A couple of things that you can do in order to minimize this risk of getting charged into anyway is make sure that your opponent's bases do not fit between the gaps that you are setting up with your Aquilon. If your opponent is charging with 25mm bases, your Aquilons need to be closer than an inch together, such that they cannot charge through engagement range and into the target on the backside. Ideally, you're going to want to try and wrap your opponent as well. If you have a line around them such that they cannot move around the edge of your units, it becomes way more difficult for them to actually land charges into the targets that they really wanted to. An alternative to this is if you wrap around your own vehicle such that they cannot get to it at all. But the biggest thing is making sure that they do not have a path where even with maximum movement, they could potentially get into the target that they care about. Also note that this does not work against things that can fly, because they are just going to fly over your screen. So if you're trying to block out a charge by Angron, you need to make sure that he does not have a place that he can land in order to get into the original target that he wants to. So let's go ahead and start talking about the other things that you can do with your rapid ingress that people have not been talking about nearly as much. Remember that Aquilons have assault weapons on almost all of their guns. I think the Long Las and the Flamer Sentry are about the only things that don't. So especially against things that have a 12-inch deep strike denial, things like the GSC Clamavis or the Tau Darkstrider, you can use rapid ingress in order to put Aquilons in a position where they can clear your opponent on the next turn. This is really good for clearing off these characters such that future Aquilons and Scions can potentially get into better positions later. If you are somehow able to give your Aquilons move, remember that they're going to be moving 9 plus d6, which is almost always going to get them into a position where they can shoot, simply because you should be expecting about a 12-inch move and then the ability to shoot with your Aquilons afterwards. Another thing that we can do is we can drop instant OC anywhere. Something that I was able to do in the guard mirror is because my opponent fell back so many things that were looking at an objective, he only left 3 OC on an objective, and I was able to use rapid ingress in order to put enough OC on that objective to not only deny him extend battle lines, but also to be in a perfect position so I could shoot him on the next turn. You just have to be careful when you do this that most secondary cards are going to be scoring at the end of your opponent's turn. So you need to make sure you're going to be dropping in a position where they cannot take any real damage. Or at the very least, if they do take some damage, that you're still going to have enough OC on the objective at the end of it. The other major part of this is you can drop your guys to score points for you. If your opponent has neglected to put things that can see an objective that you don't have any OC on currently, you can rapid Ingress Aquilons and just put them onto an objective such that you can score more primary going into your turn. This one isn't unique to Aquilons. This is something that you can look to do with Scions too, especially at MSU. But Aquilons can be a little bit better at it. Okay, let's talk about the orders and stratagems that we're going to be using for Aquilons before we finally close this out with a couple of general strategy things. It's worth noting that it's pretty hard to give Aquilons orders because they are generally going into places that no one else can get to, and they're also doing it in the movement phase. So the only real way we're generally giving them orders is if we're dropping them near a Scion Command Squad or Gaunt's Ghosts. So in general, the most common order you're actually going to be giving Aquilons is Duty on Honor in order to make them OC2. This is something you only ever do when it's going to actually be relevant to flipping a point, but it's something to keep in mind. After that, Take Aim. It's hard to give, but it's the only order that you can give them to increase their damage output, since I think all of their weapons are Assault and none of them have Rapid Fire. So the only way to increase their damage output is by giving them +1 ballistic skill instead of giving them extra shots, because that's not possible. Another one that you will use every now and then, move, move, move. Like I said, 9 inches plus Assault gives them a massive threat range, but you don't do it very often. And then the ones that you don't do, First Ring Fire, Second Ring Fire doesn't do anything. You can't charge after you go for a 3-inch deep strike, so fixed bayonets is pretty much a never. And then take cover is usually something you'd want to use when you're rapid ingressing, but how, right? You cannot rapid ingress a second unit in order to give them even more orders on that turn. So these orders almost never come up. Okay, the most important stratagem to do with these Aquilons is Grenade. Being able to drop within 3 inches of a target means that you can chuck a grenade at them. However, if you want to do that, remember that most TOs are going to rule that if you drop and shoot your sentry, you are not going to be able to grenade during your shooting phase. However, I have already heard that some TOs are allowing this, so just keep that in mind. Ask the TO before you get to the event. Also remember that grenade is more damage than the sentry turret into anything that is T4 or higher. So if you really need to kill Scout Marines or Stealth Suits, you want to do it with the grenade instead of shooting the Flamer. The other one that you're going to be doing on Aquilons a lot is reinforcements. Because Aquilons can get to places that no other unit in the game really can, you're going to want to have some of these put into reserve. Remember, if you use reinforcements on something, it is no longer bound by being forced to come in by end of turn 3. If you use reinforcements on something on turn 2, those Aquilons can stay in reserve the entire game, and force your opponent to respect where they're going to go for every turn of the game. And just having access to 3-inch deep strike on turn 5 is something that not a lot of armies have access to and can really change the flow of the game, especially if you're going second. Rapid Ingress comes up a lot, but I've already talked about this a lot, so just go back to the previous slides. Go to ground is something I copied from a different presentation. The other thing to keep in mind is that Aquilons have the smoke keyword for some reason, so, if you need to keep them alive, sometimes you can pop smoke and get -1 to hit. That's pretty cool. Let's talk about the general strategy of Aquilons in general. So the first thing to keep in mind, if you can't come up with effective ways to use a 3-inch deep strike, you need a better imagination. So now you can get access to pretty much any target that doesn't have access to a 12-inch reinforcements denial, like we said, things like a Clamavis in GSC or Darkstrider in Tau. Anything that doesn't have these is now really easy for Aquilons to get to. And if it's not easy, it's because your opponent is devoting a ton of resources in order to make sure that Aquilons cannot get where they want to go. So what I oftentimes see players do is they'll drop 2 or sometimes all 3 Aquilons in on turn 2 for a couple of different reasons. One, you just want to kill all of your opponent's scoring pieces as early as possible so that they have to start turning around more valuable assets across the rest of their army. And 2, if you somehow can't get access to those targets, you just create a move block screen such that your opponents cannot get access to the midboard. It's not really important that Aquilons are going to live, and if your opponent is actually going to be committing CP to overwatch you, remember, if we have 2 CP, we can let them die, and then they can come back into the exact same place once again. Because when they go into reserve, they are then able to come back in the same movement phase. So something you can generally look to do is you can force your opponent to turn around. Any unit that has to turn around and move towards their own board edge to deal with your Aquilons is a unit that is now not fighting for the midboard. If you do this to melee units, those units that are now on your opponent's board edge are likely never getting back into the game, which is just as good as killing them. Another major thing that you can do, and something that's targeted at players who have a little bit more experience underneath their belt, is think about what the primary mission you're currently on. On missions like Take and Hold with hidden supplies or Purge the Foe, denying any single primary objective is nowhere near as important. Simply because on Take and Hold, you can score more primary later in the game, and on Purge the Foe, you're only really scoring one objective most of the time anyway. However, on missions like Lynchpin and Scorched Earth, your opponent is required to pay more attention to holding their home objective. Simply because every objective you don't score on Scorched Earth is one that you are likely never making up later on in the game because of the fact that you cannot have the comeback mechanics on Scorched Earth because there's less primary possible per turn. Lynchpin also requires your home objective to be under your control in order for all the other objectives to be worth more points. So if you can get your opponent off of one objective on Scorched Earth or get them off of their home on Lynchpin, it is way more impactful than getting them off of an objective on Take and Hold or Purge the Foe. And just as we said before, if we are forcing our opponent to, and just as we said before, if you're forcing your opponent to devote extra units to defend your home objective, this can be just as effective as killing them. Because now they're not playing for the midboard, they're not playing to deny our primary, they're not playing to score secondaries across the rest of the board. The other thing to really think about is talk about the different terrain that you're going to be playing on. Now, I play mostly on Games Workshop terrain, so that is what I am most familiar with. However, the principles I'm about to talk about are principles that are true of UKTC terrain, Texas terrain, or WTC. You just have to pay attention to what is available. Other thing here is every single time I talk about one of these things, I'm looking at the bottom left for the green deployment home objective. Just keep that in mind. On Games Workshop 1, the home castle is too big for even a Lord Solar command brick to fully screen on its own. It's either going to need help screening out the northern ruin, the eastern ruin, or the backboard edge. So your opponent's going to need to devote 2, maybe 3 units in order to screen out this home objective, which makes it very easy for Aquilons to get access to this spot. To contrast, Pariah Nexus 2, the home castle is pretty easy to screen with a Lord Solar command brick. However, in order to screen out the bottom board edge, you need to be basically within 4 inches of the board edge, which suddenly means that you're going to have to expose this unit to firing angles along the southern wall. And this is something that we can exploit. Games Workshop 3 is similarly almost impossible to fully screen because you have so many different angles that you can get upon this opponent's home objective. If you're going to be spreading out something like a Lord Solar command brick, you're going to get shot along the southern board edge, and that can be taking you off of your home objective as well. Now, Games Workshop 7 is tough to screen as well, but not because you're exposing yourself to firing lanes, but rather because the area northwest of the objective, behind that ruin, is a place that you don't generally want to be putting your units anyway. Because those units are not doing anything about the front line, and they are there entirely to screen. And so you have a ton of free real estate in the northwest of that area. So you have a lot of opportunities for rapid ingress and then using the assault keyword in order to actually get people off of that home objective. Or force your opponent to put some cheap stuff up in the northwest, and then you can spend 1 turn killing it with 1 unit of Aquilons, and then you can use the space that you have just opened in order to force your opponent to turn way more assets around immediately afterwards. So one of the major gripes that I've been hearing about Aquilons is I don't understand why I take them. They're just 40 more points than taking Scions, and I'm going to be using Scions to score for cheaper. However, if you're using your Aquilons to score, that's a failure case. That is not what we want to be using Aquilons for. Yes, it's true that Aquilons can get almost anywhere for things like behind enemy lines or containment. But this is a job that other parts of your army can do. Just like we said, with Scions, Scions are cheaper. Scions are better for that purpose. So if you're using your Aquilons to score, it's probably because you're playing up against entirely like Chaos Knights, where they do not have anything that they're going to be playing against. So how many units of Aquilons should you bring? Well, right now, when they're currently costing 90 points, they are absurdly broken. So you should be bringing at minimum 2 and arguably 3. There is not currently a guard list that you can really build that is not better with at least 1 unit of Aquilons. And simply having 1 unit of them in your army forces your opponent to screen in ways that they would not normally otherwise. 2 is even better than just having 1, because after you drop the first one, you still have another one in reserve that you can use to bring in and do the exact same play a second time. However, 3 starts to run into diminishing returns because they're expensive scoring pieces against things like Chaos Knights. There are going to be armies where you don't really have a use for the Aquilons because they can't charge block because Chaos Knights are just going to kill you with all of their indirect fire. and they don't have targets to really kill. So at that point, they do become just expensive Scions. So that's the question you're going to ask yourself. Are there a lot of armies in the area where I am not going to be loving having a third unit of Aquilons? Unfortunately, that's not something I can answer for you. It's going to depend entirely on what is in your local meta. Now, something that I kind of forgot to make a slide about, and I'm just going to talk about it right here, is one of the most annoying things that you can do with Aquilons is, let's say you're playing against like orcs or world eaters. On turn 2, if you go first, you just string Aquilons from one board edge to another, so your opponent can't move. And that's honestly like it. Like, you're not going to do any damage with them, but if your opponent loses an entire turn of movement because you spent 180 points to just like string out guys, you're going to be driving some players insane. Just make sure they can't charge you afterwards after they like shoot your line to death. But if you have 3 units of Aquilons and you do this turn 2, they die, and then you do it again turn 3, sometimes that's enough of a primary lead that your opponent just can't win. Anyway, just kind of keep that one in mind. So pretty much everything that I've said in here, I have done in at least one game already. There are a couple more niche things, like the clearing screens in the same phase that you're trying to bring in other units. That one I have not been able to pull off just quite yet, but it is possible. But I have successfully pulled off the charge blocking already. I have successfully killed a solar command break. I have used them to deny secondaries. I've used them to deny primary. These are all things that you can already do in your games that just require a little bit of imagination. So just look for cool things that you can do with the Aquilons, and you are almost always going to be able to find them. So with that, let's go ahead and close out with the last couple of outro things. I want to say thank you once again to members. If you are already a member, make sure you join the Discord. There's an article you can find. I'll try and link it in the description where you can come connect your Discord account to your YouTube account, and you can come find the Discord. If you are not a member, if you want to be a part of the Discord, the password is still Kazerkin. Send me a message on Discord or on Reddit. I mean, if you want to do it on Twitter, I don't check Twitter very often, but you can. But thank you so much. You guys are the real goats. It's really nice to feel appreciated, and of course to help offset the cost of this wonderful hobby that we all play. Some upcoming plans. I got a couple of GTs still coming up. I'm going to California Cup in San Diego, California on November 8th. I will be at Battleshock in San Francisco November 23rd, and I'm probably going to Mad GT in San Francisco November 30th. I'm actually bringing a whole bunch of the guys that I played teams with at SoCal Open to Battleshock as well. So if you see a bunch of guys in Hawaiian shirts, that's us. Other things I'm still looking to do that are upcoming. I'm still looking at maybe doing a World Championships of Warhammer roundtable preview with people like Nick Jagiello and Robert Moreland and anybody else who I can find who is also going to that event. Other than that, now that we have our codex announced, I'll probably do Officer Training School Ogren because they went down in price and they're still pretty cool. But I'm a little bit worried because I think some of these guides might only be good for like a month and a half or something. So let me know if that's still something you guys want to see. Anyway, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Officer Training School. My name has been Joshua Joushi Howard. Hopefully, this gives you some ideas on how to use your Tempestus Aquilons better, and hopefully, now that we are the best army in the game, you will see a little bit more success over the next couple of weeks. So, with all that said, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys all next time. Bye-bye.